It's December 21st, and we are talking about Biloxi Blues with Rabbi Serrata.
Well, welcome, everyone. Nice to see you. Glad you could join us today. And we are talking about Biloxi Blues from 1988. This is another one by Neil Simon. So, I've had various reasons for pairing things together, but this is the most obvious reason, that they're both by Neil Simon. And this is the middle chapter of a three movie series that he wrote that are kind of really the closest thing to autobiography, I think, that he wrote. They all begin with a double B. So the first one was Brighton Beach Memoirs. This one is Biloxi Blues, and the last one is Broadway Bound, right? So in the first two movies, the character that represents Neil Simon in them played by Matthew Broderick in both cases. So if you were to go back to Brighton Beach Memoirs, I'm pretty sure he plays the same character, Eugene Morris Jerome, in that one. In the third movie, he finally got a little bit too old to play the young Neil Simon, so they hired somebody else. Jonathan Silverman, I think, plays him in the third movie. So it's written by Neil Simon, who we talked about quite a bit last week. You remember, his plays have been performed more than anyone else, maybe even Shakespeare, from some of the things that I was seeing about him. But the more productions of his work. He's nominated for many Tony Awards for his plays, and several Emmy Awards as well, and an Oscar or two along the way. So from a Jewish family in New York, and grew up there and largely spent his life in New York. Occasionally spent some time out in Los Angeles, when he was actively working on some movies there, but always preferred to live in New York. So the director of this movie is one of the singular talents, I think, of the 20th century, to be honest, Mike Nichols. Mike Nichols is in that rare club of people that we can call an EGOT, right? He's won Emmys, an Emmy, Grammy, Tony, and Oscar. He won Oscars as a director for The Graduate, right? And was nominated 4 other times for the Oscar and didn't win, for The Remains of the Day, Working Girl, Silkwood, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which was actually his first movie as a director. He, I believe, has won more Tonys for directing than anybody else. So Tony for his direction on Broadway, very much associated with Neil Simon in a lot of ways through the years. He won the Tony for Barefoot in the Park. Let's see, The Love, L-U-V, it was called, The Odd Couple, Plaza Suite, Prisoner of Second Avenue, The Real Thing, and as a producer, actually, for Annie. And he won his last Tony, I think, for, he won a Tony for Spamalot, directing the Monty Python musical, and also for The Death of a Salesman revival with Dustin Hoffman, which was his last Tony award as a director. He actually had 7 more plays that he was nominated for. So think about that over the course of 30 years. I mean, it's a remarkable story as a theater director and as a movie director. He won his Emmy he won a couple of Emmys, actually. One was for the direction of a play for television called Wit with Emma Thompson. And he also won one for what he actually considered to be his greatest achievement, his direction of Angels in America, the Tony Kushner play, and he did a marvelous job directing that for television as well. In addition to the movies that he directed, he was nominated for. He's made some other fantastic movies. He directed, I think, 20 movies, 22 movies, maybe something like that. A few that were not nominated for things, but that you may remember. The Birdcage, the remake of La Cage aux Folles with Robin Williams and Nathan Lane. Carnal Knowledge with a wonderful cast back in the day. A movie called Wolf, which is sort of a satire with Jack Nicholson becoming a werewolf. It's the real wolf on Wall Street, actually. It's how becoming a werewolf will help you succeed in business, right? It's a very interesting film. Charlie Wilson's War and Closer, and one that I like a lot with Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty called The Fortune, that is not thought of very often, but very good, actually. At least that's my recollection of it from a long time ago. And so he won his, so we've mentioned Oscar, Emmy, and Tony. The Grammy he won with Elaine May for Best Spoken Word recordings for their comedy albums back in the early 1960s. Mike Nichols is one of the founders of what becomes Second City here in Chicago. He was in the original cast of Second City with Elaine May and a couple of other well-known folks like Ed Asner and the Pivens, who are probably best known today as being the parents of Jeremy Piven, who's done pretty well in recent years. But there's a Piven Theater here in Chicago still. But Nichols and May were a terrific comedy team that came out of Second City. And, again, something that they started more or less thinking that it was just fun for them, and then be something like Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks doing the 2,000-Year-Old Man, and then it became a national sensation. They were reported to be the quickest minds in the world, were how they were described when they would perform. So if you haven't heard them or haven't heard them lately, some of those skits are still extremely funny. Some are a little dated, perhaps, but they're still quite remarkable. So they're very funny. So I really do think that Mike Nichols is a singular talent, really something special, and he brings something special, I think, to this movie. So we can talk about that as we go on. Mention some of the actors and actresses in this. Of course, the two biggest parts in the show are Matthew Broderick playing the Neil Simon character, Eugene Morris Jerome. He played this part on Broadway as well. And, Broderick got his start a little bit more on stage. By the way, his mother is Jewish. Was born in 1962. He was first cast in Brighton Beach Memoirs on stage, and then kind of made his first impact on screen in a movie written by Neil Simon called Max Dugan Returns. And then, of course, became forever cemented in people's minds as Ferris Bueller in Ferris Bueller's Day Off in 1986. He won the Tony for his appearance in Brighton Beach Memoirs, that Neil Simon play back in 1982. And he's been nominated for the Tony a couple of times for musicals. Actually, he was the revival of How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. He was nominated for that. And of course, he was nominated for his role in The Producers, the Mel Brooks musical version of The Producers, the original Broadway cast. And he lost that Tony to his co-star Nathan Lane, actually, that year. So, and then of course in movies, you may remember him in a number of things besides Ferris Bueller. If you had kids the right age, you may know that he played Simba in The Lion King. He was the voice of Simba in the original animated version. A couple of his movies, there are many, but a couple that I like very much. He's in Torch Song Trilogy, the Harvey Fierstein.
Thank you.
He is in Glory with Denzel Washington, and Election which was the first movie by a guy named Alexander Payne, where he's terrific as a high school teacher. And a personal joy that I like is the movie The Freshman that he's in with Marlon Brando and Maximilian Schell, and a comedy. It's pretty funny. So been in many more things in recent years. He's been playing a lot more character parts rather than leading man parts as he starts to grow into his age. Right? So for years he played characters a decade or 2 decades younger than his chronological age on screen. So and then of course the other large part I'd say in the movie is Sergeant Toomey, played by Christopher Walken. Christopher Walken is one of those actors who can do just about anything. He does serious roles and comic roles. He does song and dance. You may remember him in Hairspray a few years ago, or Pennies from Heaven, where and in fact, in most of his roles, he seems to have worked in a little bit of a dance routine in many films where it's only appropriate because it's Christopher Walken puts it into the character. Right. So he was born in 1943 in Queens, New York. He won the Oscar pretty early in his career for his role in the Deer Hunter, and then was nominated and won again fairly recently in a Steven Spielberg movie called Catch Me If You Can with Leonardo DiCaprio. He was in several movies before he became a star. I'd say I'm one that I would show this group if it was available to watch on any of the streaming services. Next Stop, Greenwich Village. He has a good role in that in the mid 70s, but it's right around 1976, 77. He really bursts on the scene with 2 roles in the same year, Annie Hall and The Deer Hunter. So in Annie Hall, of course, he plays Annie Hall's brother, Dwayne, I think is the name, who has essentially one scene in the movie, but it's remembered by everybody who's ever seen it, I think. And that's Christopher Walken. He can steal a movie from anybody he's in it with, right? For those of you who've seen Pulp Fiction, I mean, he also has one scene in the movie Pulp Fiction, one monologue that is pretty much unforgettable. So about a watch. So a difficult movie to watch in some ways, but watching Christopher Walken do that one scene is a remarkable moment in it. What else has he been in? He's been in Batman movies. He was in the Anderson tapes with Sean Connery. That's back in 1971, I think, if memory serves. Right. He was. There's a new version of Macbeth coming out with Denzel Washington in it in a couple of weeks, I think. He was in an adaptation of Macbeth, which is called Scotland, Pennsylvania, which I'm willing to bet nobody on the call has seen Scotland, Pennsylvania. Am I right? It takes Macbeth and sets it in a fast food franchise in a small town in Pennsylvania. It's quite an interesting piece of work, actually, and he's in that as well. So if you ever run across it in some weird place, you might enjoy it. So in some of the smaller roles, we certainly point out Corey Parker, who plays Epstein. Right? So Arnold B. Epstein, the character's name, and is really well respected as an acting teacher. You may have seen him in some stuff. He's had a long career as a character actor, and appears in many things, many TV series and things like that. But never became a big star. But as an acting teacher, he has taught some of the biggest stars around, actually. So and does quite a credible job, I think, in this movie as well. Some of the smaller parts we could mention, Casey Shymashko, who's let's see, what character does he play? I think I didn't write it down. He's the one who sings, in his sleep and stuff. And was in a lot of the Brat Pack movies of the 1980s. Actually, just interesting in looking him up, I found out that his father was a fighter in the Polish underground and survived Sachsenhausen concentration camp. So just a biographical note for him. Yeah. He was actually also born in Chicago. So I always like to point out the folks who are from around here. So he was born here in 1965, actually. And I'll mention Penelope Ann Miller, who actually is in that movie that I mentioned a while back, The Freshman, with Matthew Broderick. She was born in 1964 in Los Angeles. She's been in a ton of things. Hasn't necessarily received a lot of recognition over the years, but she's appeared with some of the greatest actors, and she does a great job herself. She was in the movie Awakenings with Robert De Niro. She was in Chaplin with Robert Downey Jr. playing one of his wives, I think. And she was in Carlito's Way with Al Pacino. And she was actually in the movie that won the best Oscar for Best Picture a few years ago, the silent movie, The Artist. So she's got a nice role in that as well. So she's been around a lot. I'm sure others of you can remember her in some other things as well. So mention the music. So of course, a lot of the music in this movie is from the time period, right? So a lot of big band classics and things like that. Blue Moon appears, I think, in the scene with the prostitute, if memory serves. The opening credits has the song "How High the Moon," I believe. So some songs that have been recorded many times over the years. But so there are some period songs in the movie. And then there's also some original music that's written for the movie as well. I'll just mention that it's by a French composer, Georges Delarue, who was born in France in 1925 and started composing for French films in 1950. He's another one of those guys whose names you may not know, but whose music you've heard many, many times. I mean, he wrote maybe 100 film scores, something like that. He wrote the score for, he was nominated for 5 Oscars, I think. He won for a movie called A Little Romance with Laurence Olivier and a young Diane Lane in it. So he won the Oscar that year. He was nominated 4 other times for Anne of a Thousand Days, Day of the Dolphin, which is another Mike Nichols directed film, Julia with Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave, and Agnes of God. So, and in addition, he wrote music to a lot of movies that you've probably seen, like Platoon, Silkwood, which was again a Mike Nichols movie. So they worked together several times. Steel Magnolias, Beaches, many films that have been pretty well known over the years. So, he's listed here only as writing music, not a score, and that's because of all of the period songs that are in the movie. He just writes sort of incidental music that comes up here and there in the film. So, but worth mentioning because he is a great talent. So, the only thing I didn't mention about Mike Nichols, of course, from a Jewish family, in case you didn't know, he was actually born in Berlin in 1931. His family came to America as refugees in 1939. And he, as a child, he developed alopecia. I don't know who knows what effect things have on people's careers, right? So he lost all of the hair on his body and his head at the time he was 4. He wore a hairpiece and fake eyebrows for the rest of his life, actually. He said when he came to America, he knew two sentences in English, which was, I do not speak English, and please do not kiss me. So those are the two things he knew how to say. He was, his name is of Russian descent, actually, though he born in Berlin. His name was Michal Igor Peshkowski, but his father came to America a couple of years before he and his brother and his mother. And his father was a doctor and actually came to America and started to practice. And he actually took the name Nichols. So that's how Michal Peshkowski became Mike Nichols. So I saw a hand up from Ed. Was it something to add about Mike Nichols? No? Okay. So, he was a pretty interior guy in some ways, although everybody who ever met him said he was kind and compassionate and maybe not your typical Hollywood director. So he said there was a movie he was making, and originally Mandy Patinkin was cast in the lead. And after a couple of days of shooting, didn't think that the Mandy Patinkin was working out and had to replace him. So, and he said it's the one thing he's sort of regretted through his life was that he couldn't make that work. Actually, so it's sort of interesting to hear him talk about that late in his life. He passed away just a couple of years ago. Well, I guess it's been 6 or 7 already, but not that long. So I see Sue has a hand up. Sue, well,
yeah, about Mike Nichols and Elaine May. When you mentioned about them getting their start at Second City, many years ago, when I was very young, I think I must have been either a senior in high school or early on in college years. There was a precursor to the Second City, a comedy club in Chicago, and I think it was at Broadway and Devon. Mm-hmm. And I remember going there with a date and seeing Mike Nichols and Elaine May.
Yeah. I off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of that. Before it was called Second City, it was
exactly, and I can't remember the name either.
Right.
Was it the Compass Players?
Compass, yes, that's what it was.
Compass Players.
Exactly.
Compass Players.
That's what it was. Right.
It actually started in Hyde Park.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
So yeah, it's So anyway, so so some great talent here. I hope you like the movie, and let's talk about it some. I think there's a few things that I'd like to point out, and then whatever other folks have to say. From a technique point of view, I just want to point out the mirror beginning and ending, right? I mean, this is sort of a classic kind of thing, but at the beginning of the movie, we see a close-up of Matthew Broderick and in a train window, pull back, see the train from an aerial shot crossing the Mississippi, headed from east to over to Arkansas, and then down to Mississippi. And so at the end of the movie, as they're leaving, right, we see him in close up in the train window. The camera pulls back to an aerial shot so that we can see the train going back in the other way, back to New York City, right? So see if you think about it, the total time elapsed in this movie is about 10 weeks, right? 10 weeks of basic training, and then before the war ends, before they can be sent overseas. Now, I don't know if that's exactly right in terms, once you're drafted into the Army, you get 2 years, whether you're deployed or not, so I'm not sure that this is exactly the way it worked, but it's very satisfying for the movie, I think. And so I'm going to point that out. I think in terms of a couple of scenes, of course, that stand out. I mean, I think there's, of course, the scene near the end, is remarkable, right? But it's set up by something a little bit earlier, right? When he has a conversation, when Eugene has a conversation with Arnold and Arnold says to him, "You're a bystander, right? You're watching everything from outside of it until you have to stand up for something. You have to fight for something." And this is, what for what? He says, "Whatever, but you'll never be a writer until you actually are in the middle of it, right?" And then, of course, this pays off towards the end of the movie in Sergeant Toomey's dramatic breakdown, at the end, where he puts himself in place of Epstein in that moment and has to actually act and be in the moment, right? So it's I think a credit to again to the performers, and particularly to Christopher Walken there, that you do believe that that Jerome is in real danger, even though we know he's the hero of the movie and he's narrating it and all sorts of things. There are very few movies narrated by dead people. I mean, there's there are a couple. I mean, so you shouldn't assume that there are none. I mean, the most famous is probably Sunset Boulevard, narrated by William Holden, who's dead in the pool from the opening scene, right? But there are a few others as well. But you do have the sense of real menace in that, because of how good Christopher Walken is, I think, in the role. But you have this sense of real danger there. The other thing I'd say that the movie talks about a lot in various ways and shows us in various ways is what you can't tell from looking at a person, right? It's this comes up in among the enlisted men in terms of they are capable of surprising in a lot of ways, right? And that shows up both in terms of who's gay and who's not gay, right? That's a part of it, right? There's a scene, I like the scene where the most blatantly anti-Semitic of the soldiers comes in and starts to mess with Epstein. Epstein says, I converted to Catholicism yesterday. And so, what you can't tell by looking at a person, right? So I think it's an interesting theme that kind of runs through this. There's kind of a theme of nostalgia as well. I think that's sort of a secondary thing, but that in the last voiceover he talks about that this was the happiest time of his life, right? Now we've just seen it; it doesn't look that happy most of the time, right? He said, "I liked it because I was young," and he said, I didn't like those guys. And now looking back on it, I love every damn one of them. Right? It's kind of interesting. Life is weird, I think that's the last line in the movie. And I think there's some truth to that, right? The sense of, not the part that life is weird. I think we all know that that's true. But this sense that, what we tend to create our own story of what actually happened in moments of great distance from us, and we are unreliable narrators of our own lives and spin stories, out of our past, so that we can look back on something that at the time was actually traumatic, and even in the retelling seems dramatic. I mean, the events of this movie seem pretty traumatic to me in a lot of ways. and yet the narrator is telling us it was the best time of his life, right? There's even the moment, Sergeant Toomey tells when he's drunk how much they're going to miss him, and says that they had another guy come in for the last 4 weeks. He was sane and he was organized and those things, and we realized how much we miss Toomey. As the line is, never underestimate the stimulation of eccentricity. So, which is a good line, but I would say that Sergeant Toomey was more than eccentric, right? And that's kind of underplaying the trauma again. So I think that's an interesting through line in the movie, is the unreliability of the narrator, who at the very end tells us that everything in this movie is true, except the prostitute didn't give him a second time for free. So, but none of it's true, right? It's written by a playwright, idealizing a story of the life that he had in this moment. So I think that there's a kind of a meta story to it too, that's kind of interesting. I believe it's beautifully written, beautifully played. So I'll give you guys a chance. Any thoughts, any comments about it?
Ed,
Yeah.
I got you. I muted you.
Okay. There was a lot of truism in that movie because I spent boot camp in the Marine Corps in almost the exact similar type of barracks. It looked like just about the same thing, with the double, the beds one on top of another and lousy springs, and your foot locker at the foot of the bed. The drill sergeants in the Marine Corps, there weren't quite as many. There were a lot of push-ups, but not 100 or 200 at a crack. Yeah. Maybe 50 or 30 or what have you. And there was a lot more screaming. Walken didn't scream too much. He talked a little bit loud. Drill sergeants in the Marine Corps screamed a lot and what have you. But it was a very realistic representation of that type of a situation.
Yeah, and I do want to say that Christopher Walken
also, there was anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I went in boot camp with almost a total black enlisted platoon from Chicago. About 70% of the platoon were black guys from Chicago, but there were others. But I ran into anti-Semitism, not from the black guys, but from others when I was in boot camp.
Yeah. I mean, I've certainly heard that story many times from people, and just a certain amount of hatred and ignorance and those kinds of things. So that I've certainly heard many times from folks. That Christopher Walken actually talked about in an interview, making a very specific choice to not have his character be shouting all the time, which was interesting. Partly because, there are other movies about people in boot camp, and whether they're comic or serious, the drill sergeant is always loud and bombastic, and Christopher Walken plays against that type in the movies, and in some ways makes the character all the more sinister for being a little bit more quiet, right? It's again, I think a wonderful acting choice in collaboration with his director, with Mike Nichols, to create this drill sergeant that you haven't quite seen this guy on screen before, right? And yet, that the mind games he's playing with these guys, he's done over and over, right? Though He is still quite young, if you think about it. The character, I'm not sure how grizzled your drill sergeant was, but you know, in a lot of movies, they're already the old timers, you know, right? And this guy is not so much of an old timer. It's a couple other hands up.
So we have Susan Berlowitz, Linda, Sandy Kaminsky, John. So Susan Berlowitz, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I love the film and I like the acting. And I was wondering, like with the character that Walken played, if the fact that he had hoped to be a career Army man, but he was going in for a surgery, which would probably end his career, if that's why he became so drunk and so difficult at the very end.
Yeah. I think that's a fair reading, certainly, that's what sets him off finally, right? Is he knows that this is the end of his military career, and that was not the way he intended to go out, right? So with everything else that's about this character, you still can find some reserve of sympathy for him, I think, you know, in this situation. You know, he's, again, in a lot of movies, the drill sergeant is really the bad guy, you know? And in this case, he is, but he's also human, you know, and dealing with his own disappointment and or not dealing with it. So I think we can sympathize with him a little bit.
Linda Alexander.
Hold on a second.
I unmuted you.
Okay. I had a question for you that I missed, and I didn't know about the Second World War. Were these young men enlisted or were they drafted?
By and large, these were draftees, I think. I mean, you know, now because there may have been some mix, and I won't claim to be any sort of an expert on this at all, but you know, there was certainly a draft in those days, you know, I can only give the example. My own father enlisted, you know, after Pearl Harbor in 1941. He went to enlist, and he was in his last year of dental school, and the Army told him that they wanted a dentist. So he was one semester away from graduation. So they told him to come back to the University of Illinois, finish dental school, and then come back and enlist in the medical corps. So so that was his experience. So I guess I mention it only in the sense that those who chose to enlist sometimes had a little more flexibility in terms of where they were sent and things like that. So my dad's experience of basic training is nothing like these guys, right? My dad's basic training in the medical corps was at a hotel in Miami Beach. You know, I can't say it was total luxury, but compared to Biloxi, Mississippi, yeah, you know, the rifle training for dentists and doctors was to take a gun and shoot it at the ocean, you know, and if they hit the ocean, that was good enough. So my dad's Army career is a lot more like MASH than it is like this movie. So he loved the movie MASH. He thought that one of the few times I really remember my father laughing out loud at a movie was seeing that one.
And I had one other observation. I was hysterical with when they first got there and how hot it was, and how these young men from New York were complaining so much. And I just was hysterical with Matthew Broderick's character saying, well, can we order out?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I mean, these were such typical New York fellas saying things like that,
right,
that I was hysterical with it. I found it very funny, but I really truly believe you have to be of the male persuasion to really enjoy this, maybe being in the Army or in the reserves. I think that's my opinion. I found it very humorous though.
Yeah. I will say something about My dad was from New York, upstate, not New York City, and was stationed in Waycross, Georgia, for a significant part of the war, working on pilots' teeth in the Army Air Corps. But and my parents got married during the war, and my dad used to liked sour cream. And my mother would tell the story of trying to get from the local dairy in Waycross, Georgia, sour cream, and they had never heard of it, right? She asked them do you have sour cream? And the woman said, we never let it get that way. So that's a famous family story, which I believe is actually true. And but there were a lot of things in Waycross, Georgia, that were not available to a Jewish boy from New York, my father. So I'm
sure they couldn't get lox and bagels either.
I'm sure not. There was a Passover Seder on the base. Yeah, just I'm not sure who ran it, where it came from, but it certainly wasn't from Waycross, Georgia.
No. Sandy, John, and then Susan Wellick. Sandy Kaminsky, go ahead.
I loved the movie, really loved it, and especially the music. I thought the music was just beautiful.
Yeah.
My sister, I remember when I was 6 years old, she enlisted in the Marines. She shocked the whole family. She was such a shy person. And she just went down and enlisted in the Marines and was stationed at Camp Lejeune in South Carolina. 2 years later, my brother enlisted. He was 17, and he went to Biloxi, Mississippi.
Yeah.
And I remember putting him on that train at Dearborn Street Station. It was very memorable putting a teenage boy on the train. My parents were so worried in 44 when he went in, but loved the movie.
Well, there was a lot to worry about in 44. In terms of what was going on in Europe and in the South Pacific, right? This movie pointedly starts in 1945. And so, even before it starts, we have some sense that these guys are not in the mortal danger that soldiers who enlisted in 42 and 43 and 44 were. So, right, assuming some history and things like that. So I think that's interesting, that maybe it's truthful to Neil Simon's experience, but it also lowers the stakes a little bit in terms of the movie, right? It's much more about these guys and their relationship with each other or lack thereof, than it is about what they're going to have to do, right? This movie is not Saving Private Ryan, for example, right?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Also, I remember that a lot of people used to say that Jews were draft dodgers, and it wasn't true. Every one of my cousins, besides my brother-in-law, my brother, and my sister being in, all of my cousins were in the service. Some were at Guadalcanal, and I was just a kid then, but I remember all of them coming home in their uniforms, and none of them were draft dodgers.
No, of course not. So I will say that the Jews in this time period, and in some ways, were a little bit damned if you do and damned if you don't, right? Because there was, as Ed brought up, some of the sense of anti-Semitism. I've heard the story many times from different veterans that as Jews, their commanding officers immediately put them into clerical roles, right? That they would be, out of partly out of a kind of an anti-Semitic belief that they were inherently good at, doing the inventory and the money and the different kinds of budget things that soldiers, that the troop needed. So a lot of Jewish soldiers were in a sense taken out of harm's way because of that, but they also got this reputation that they didn't want right? Didn't ask for and didn't want. And this has persisted in the Army for generations, really. I'm not sure that it's done now, to tell you the truth. So, you know, and it comes out of this weird sort of stereotype, right? That that's what we'll be good at. And so that's where we get placed, you know? So, and then it leads to the kind of things among other soldiers that we're avoiding combat, you know? So whether we're avoiding the draft or not, of course, there is no draft in America today. So not the same issue.
Right, John, and then Susan Wellek, then Alice.
I love this movie. And starting at the beginning on the train, I took that train and I crossed the Mississippi, but I went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. So I did not go as far south. I thought as Ed said, the barracks were authentic. And my drill sergeant was, this was the Army, not the Marines, but he shouted. He was Hispanic from Puerto Rico who claimed that he was from Spain. And they didn't need an excuse to get drunk on the weekends. They got drunk, the sergeants got drunk almost every weekend, but they sobered up pretty good on Monday.
Yeah.
And it was very realistic. And the basic training was crawling in mud and firing, and it was very realistic, I thought. And the bond that you make with these people that you'd never met before and you'll probably never see again. I do thank my parents for being born after the Korean War and before Vietnam. So we were pretty much at peace during 1960-61 when I was in.
Yeah.
And as far as I was sent there by my home unit in Chicago to be a clerk typist, but I, after the first week, told the sergeant or the lieutenant that I should have been teaching the course instead of taking it. So I taught English in the basic Army school for the next 4 months that I was in for 6 months active duty. And I became a firm believer. I actually enjoyed it after I figured it out within the first week. And I'm a firm believer, and I still am, of universal military training for every young man.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Maybe it's a conversation for a different class than this one, but national service, I mean, it certainly had some very valuable gifts to society, right? So I don't think the Army itself would want to go back, frankly, to an army of draftees, right? You know, in Israel, of course, there's compulsory national service for all but a few people. Well, the ultra-Orthodox don't serve, but otherwise, there's compulsory national service. And there's a lot of good that comes with that and some bad. And one of the things that they complain about in Israel is that within all draftee army, it's a lot harder to command people than people who have chosen to be there. So you know, even in having read some accounts of the 6-Day War and things like that, you know, soldiers kind of showed up where they wanted to during the 6-Day War. So, you know, that's what I see in the reading, you know, and thank God they went where they did in a lot of ways, but they weren't necessarily going where their unit was. They were going where they thought they were going to be needed because there was less sort of chain of command than there was, you know, the rights of the individual in a sense. So, and that's, you know, the American Army, I don't think can abide by soldiers exercising their rights. you know. So so I don't think the Army wants to go back to a draft, actually.
Susan Wellek and then Alice.
I too love this movie, and I had also seen the play on stage in New York before the movie came out. And I was really sympathetic with the Epstein character. I just loved him.
Yeah.
I mean, of all the, even though Matthew Broderick is terrific and so is Christopher Walken and everything, I just loved Epstein.
Right.
I thought he was terrific. And I just, if I may say, my husband spent 3 years in the United States Air Force stationed in England. And I don't remember him ever complaining about anti-Semitism. But an interesting story is when he was due to get out after 3 years. And the commanding officer of his Air Force base tried to talk him into staying in because they thought he was such a good officer and that he should stay. And he said to him, "Sir, do you know any Jewish generals in the United States Air Force?"
Yeah.
And the guy, he said to him, "No, I'm afraid I don't." And Dick said, "That's why I'm getting out." Because he felt that he had no way, he could never reach the top.
Yeah.
Because of being Jewish.
Yeah.
Right. It's John, you seem to have another opinion. There were some Jewish generals.
Well, there was a Jewish general from my reserve unit in Chicago who lived in Highland Park. Well, he became a general.
John, there were in the Army.
Ben.
And a friend of ours became a reserve general in the Army and then went on active duty, a Jewish guy from Aurora.
Yeah.
But at that time, and this was in 1963 when Dick got out of the service, and he asked the question and there weren't any, not in the Air Force.
Well, we're getting, and actually, I mean, I think the Air Force Academy has actually been kind of notorious even in recent years, but we're getting pretty far afield from the movie. So I'd like to get back to that. I do want to say something about the character of Epstein, and just, you know, it's a very this question that Jerome asks himself about why he doesn't stand up for Epstein early in the movie, right? You know, and has the sense that it's this is a more intricate question than you know, it's not simple, right? He says on the one hand he thinks that Epstein is sometimes asking for it, right? And when he talks to Epstein about it, it says, you know, Epstein essentially says, I'm doing my part, right? You know, this is what I have to do. This is what I have to say. You know, and Epstein has this conversation with Toomey where he says, I think you can get more out of these men by you know, by being compassionate. And he says, you know, what does he say? Something like, I'm not trying to make them man, I'm trying to make them obedient, right? And this has been a long-standing issue in terms of all armies. You have to get to a place where people will do what they're told, and that's not always easy to do. We even have research on soldiers in war going back, you know, a long way, that when people are directly confronted with the enemy, they have to be taught not to aim high, not to aim above people's heads, right? Nobody wants to instinctively shoot and kill other people. So there has to be a kind of a process to get people to a place where they'll do what they're told. But I also said Epstein's character, you know, certainly gets the last word in a way in that last scene of narration when it talks about where these other people are, right? So his girlfriend marries a Jewish doctor from New Orleans, she's now Horowitz, and Epstein is what is he? He's the prosecuting attorney for Brooklyn.
District attorney, yeah.
Yeah, district attorney, I think in Brooklyn, the most feared man in New York. Right. So So again, what you don't see by looking at a person, right? What he goes on to become, not terribly surprising to us. He's been reading Dostoevsky the whole time. He's been reading about justice. He's been, he's very big on ethics and the law and all of those things. So it's not a huge surprise that becomes what I guess what's a surprise is in a sense how macho that is, right? I guess, to take on the mob. So anyway, so I think he gets kind of the last word on that. Alice has had her hand up for a long
Right.
time.
Yeah.
Before Alice goes, because Rabbi, I'm going to make you the host. We have to go pick up my granddaughter.
Oh my gosh.
Don't resume again until February 1st. You have January off. And the first movie is The Human Stain, but you'll get a flyer shortly. Go ahead, Alice.
Okay, just a couple of comments. One, this goes along with the movie and then what John said about anti-Semitism. I have a friend who I think he was in basic training like in the late 60s, early 70s. And he said there was a lot of anti-Semitism. I mean, he felt there were very few Jews in his platoon or whatever. And yeah, so he felt that. And the other thing I just wanted to say, I thought they did a really good job at the beginning of the movie showing how young these men were, on the train. They're, throwing things at people, spitting. And I mean, they're acting like young men, which they were, young boys almost. And then, I know they didn't end up going fighting, but they thought they were going to. And how, I thought that was a really good way to set up the movie of, moving from being these young men in New York, going to basic training in Biloxi, and who knows where after that.
Yeah. It's a credit to the screenplay and those things. We probably haven't talked enough about the direction, but to move a play onto the screen is often it just looks like a play on film, and I think that that Mike Nichols does an excellent job of opening it up. Obviously an aerial shot of a train is not something you can do on the stage. So right from the start, he does a great job of that. The other thing we've talked about before, that when you take a stage play and you put it on screen, all of a sudden you can have close-ups and direct our eye to particular actions, which is in some ways harder to do on stage. It's done differently. Mike Nichols was a master of both of those things. The scene I might point to as being one of the most remarkable in the movie is the scene where he's getting into bed with the prostitute, and the awkwardness of that is brought to our attention so clearly in a way that you could not do on stage. It's in its way charming, I guess, but also just a great piece of directing, right? So what you're saying, I was right from the start. We're seeing who these characters are by the way they relate to each other on the train. We know something about each of them in a way before they get there. Some of that's accomplished with the narration. Some of it is the action the characters take themselves. I'm fond of the guy who's eating, a chicken bone. I think it's a chicken bone. He had the constitution of a goat. He could eat anything, right? So the things that we find out about them before they even get off the train, and then that first scene walking through the base, and it again, here's what you can't do on stage is see the geography of the camp, right? The moment you see that there are other platoons being trained in other places, we see all kinds of things, the pole falling, the ditch being dug. The joke that we're digging, we're burying some of the guys who came in last week, right, for basic training. I mean, that kind of stuff. I imagine, I never read the stage play or saw it, but some of those lines I'm sure are added for the movie because you couldn't have had that same kind of experience on stage. Not exactly. So With that, I mean, we're coming to the end of this 8 weeks of Real Jewish Classics. I thank you for your time and your attention, and I know I'm enjoying going back and watching these movies. I'm glad you are too. And so, yeah, we found another 8. So at some point, I'll be scraping the bottom of the barrel, but not yet, I think. So I think we're doing pretty well. So we'll start again in a few weeks with a new set of 8 movies. So.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. That's been
Sure.
great.
It's
Thank
my
you, Ralph.
pleasure.
Been
I wish you all a healthy and happy secular New Year, or as they say in Israel, a happy Sylvester.
A good one.
Thank you. Same to you and everybody.
Stay safe.
As we wish to you guys.
Same to you, and say hello to Seal Ann.
I will. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.